Hello. Before we get into today's episode, I just want to make a quick announcement. At the time of this episode's release, Minnesotans of all walks of life are still suffering at the hands of an occupation by ICE agents. Although DHS has publicly declared Operation Metro Surge to be over, ICE agents are still here in force and continue to stop, harass, and detain people regardless of their citizenship status. And even once the last agent is driven from the state, the financial repercussions of this surge will still be felt for a long time to come. The good news is Minnesotans are organized and activated, and there are many, many ways that you can help. We urge everyone listening to head to standwithminnesota.com. This is the most comprehensive directory we know of for ways to help people in Minnesota right now. You can donate to dozens of grassroots organizations doing work on the ground, help pay rent for families who are affected, seek out legal training or advice, find ways to volunteer or direct actions to participate in, and so much more. So please head to standwithminnesota.com. No matter who you are, where you live, or what your resources are, there are ways that you can make a difference and help people right now. Once again, that's standwithminnesota.com.
The land of 10,000 lakes, federal occupation,
and loons.
This is
Minnesota Unknown.
Each episode, we'll take a deep dive into Minnesota's storied past, with a special emphasis on the surprising, the unusual, and little-known history hidden in plain sight.
My name is Alex Weston.
I'm Josie Bergman.
I'm Hannah Norton.
And we are Minnesota Unknown.
So, Fort Snelling is in the news. We are recording this in early February of 2026, and at the moment that this is being recorded, the Twin Cities area and Minnesota more generally has been under an occupation of over 3,000 ICE agents, that's Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and they have been detaining people specifically at the Bishop Whipple Federal Building, which is in the unincorporated territory of Fort Snelling. Now, there's actually a lot of Fort Snellings. There's the unincorporated territory of Fort Snelling, which includes a lot of things. There's Fort Snelling National Guard Base. There's the Fort Snelling Cemetery. There's the Fort Snelling Chapel. There's the Fort Snelling State Park. There's historic Fort Snelling, which is a restored/recreated version of the original fort from the 1820s, run by the Minnesota Historical Society. Now, the short version of what's with all these Fort Snellings, how did they come to be, is that in 1820, the United States military began building an army fort at the junction of the Mississippi and Minnesota rivers, eventually named Fort Snelling. It was contained within an area of land claimed by the military that was the Fort Snelling Military Reservation. The conventional story is that it was purchased by the United States government in a treaty in 1805, signed by the Dakota people. So, Fort Snelling's built, and this was an active military base for 126 years. Right after World War II, the military base was officially decommissioned, so it's not a military base anymore. However, this land that was part of a military base, it isn't a part of Hennepin County, it's not a part of Ramsey County, it's not part of Minneapolis, not part of St. Paul, it's its own unorganized territory. And different parts of it have become different things. So most of the Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport is within this land that was part of the military base. The VA Center is there. The Bishop Whipple Federal Building is there. Simple, right?
Yeah.
Now, Fort Snelling generally has been in the news lately because on some of those federal lands, ICE has been staging a lot of their people and equipment, and specifically they've been detaining people at the Bishop Henry Whipple Federal Building because that is under federal control, not state control. And so it's been at the center of a lot of protest and controversy, enough so that the Minnesota Historical Society, our former employer, whom we are no longer associated with, had to put out the following clarification on their social media channels.
addressing recent confusion regarding historic Fort Snelling. The Minnesota Historical Society operates historic Fort Snelling, a historic educational site. The site is not being used for immigration enforcement. The historic site is part of the unincorporated territory of Fort Snelling, a patchwork of varied authorities and entities, including the federal government, the state of Minnesota, Hennepin County, the National Park Service, Minnesota Airport Commissions, Minnesota Historical Society, and North Star Scouting. Fort Snelling is the site of converging histories, and the complex history of the area dates back 10,000 years.
So, because of recent events, There are massive protests there, including just this week as we're recording this, a number of Dakota residents are now camping out outside of the Whipple building as a way of protesting not just the current administration, but the ongoing occupation of Dakota land. And one of the most common slogans you see on signs at protests is, "No one is illegal on stolen land." And there's been a lot of talk in the public of specifically Fort Snelling. Was it stolen? Well, it may depend on your definition, but we figured with all that, it's worth doing a deep dive into the actual history. And it's a story that's been told many times very simply. And so I'm going to ask for your patience because I think if we do tell it in its fullest possible sense, it reveals aspects that are often overlooked of this very complicated story. The more you zoom in on it, or actually the more you zoom out into the larger context, the crazier and crazier this story gets. So buckle in, folks. We are going to be talking about how the land of Bdóte, the junction of the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers, went from being the center of Dakota land to the unorganized territory of Fort Snelling. And it's going to take us across different centuries, across different nations. This is going to be a truly international tale, but it will all, in the end, come back to Fort Snelling.
Okay.
So let's start with the land itself. This is the land around the junction of what today are most commonly called the Minnesota and the Mississippi rivers. This is right in the middle of the ancestral and contemporary home of the Dakota people. Now, there are a lot of indigenous groups that are native to Minnesota and have been here a long time, but the Dakota are the only people that, in their own oral histories, this is where they've always been. So, for example, the Ojibwe have had a long-time presence in Minnesota, but their own oral histories talk about having migrated from further east along the Great Lakes. The Dakota, in the most common Dakota creation story, they are literally first put on earth, the first man and first woman, the first two Dakota people at Bdóte, at this junction of the same rivers. And it was considered by the Dakota to be the center of the earth, and all humanity spread out from there.
And what does Bdóte mean?
Bdóte means mouth, but it was also a term used more generally to refer to wherever two rivers come together.
Confluence.
So confluence, yes. When we say like the mouth of a river,
right,
we don't mean...
Yeah.
But interestingly enough, on the literal note, Bdóte was also the name for the first gasp or first sound that a baby makes. So that idea that like your first breath is... there is a sacral quality to the word Bdóte that a simple translation doesn't quite get across. And it's specifically Bdóte, Minnesota. This is the junction of the rivers that today we call it the Minnesota River. That comes from the Dakota word Wakpa, Minnesota, which means the river where the waters are clear enough to reflect the sky.
Well, and the stars are a pretty big part of that creation story, too.
Yes. There's different Dakota creation myths. And among the Dakota, they're not seen as exclusive. It's not like either one or the other. They're all true in a way that the Western mind struggles with because we like to very much literalize things. But in one of the more common Dakota creation stories, the Oceti-Sakowin, which is the 7 council fires, that's like the 7 nations that make up the larger body of the Dakota. They started as 7 stars in the sky, and there are different versions. One, they're the stars of the Big Dipper. Another, they're from the constellation Orion. But the people started as stars, and then the creator took the stars and combined them with mud at Bdóte, and that's the creation of the first humans. And Dakota, that's a word that means allies, but it referred to the different nations, or the Dakota word is Oyate, within the Oceti-Sakowin. So it's this kind of alliance of 7 different groups. And those groups are the Mediwakatan, the Sisseton, the Wahpeton, the Wapakute, the Yankton, the Yanktonai, and the Teton. And the Teton were the furthest west. They lived near the Black Hills in South Dakota. They speak a variant of the language called Lakota. So those are the Lakota people. And those are kind of the most famous native group in America, thanks to the Battle at Little Bighorn and then Hollywood. Those are the people featured in the movie Dances with Wolves. They are distant relatives of the 6 other Dakota groups who speak the Dakota language. And together, they call themselves the Oceti-Sakowin, though when the French first come into North America, before they ever met a single Dakota or Lakota person, they asked their neighbors, the Ojibwe, who lives over there? And they said, oh, the little snakes. And that's in contrast to the big snakes, which is what the Ojibwe called the Iroquois, who were on the eastern end. So the people that they would get in battles with, the big snakes and the little snakes, which in Ojibwe was Nadawisi, which gets written down in French as Nadawisu, and that gets shortened to Sioux. So To the French and later the English who picked this up, and then eventually the Americans, the broader 7 council fires are collectively known as the Sioux. So the Lakota, that's Sioux. The Wapakute, that's Sioux. The Midawakaton, those are the people who lived closest around Bdóte. They're all Sioux, but the careful thing to know is Sioux is not what they called themselves. It was actually an insulting word their enemies called them.
Yes, and knowing what their actual name is, why would you not use that?
Yeah, exactly.
Is the real question.
So the Dakota have been here for as long as anyone knows. And they definitely had a keen sense that this land is ours. That being said, Dakota ideas about land ownership were different than European ideas of land ownership in nuanced ways. And one of them is that they didn't think of the land itself so much as something that could be owned exclusively. Now, that's not the same as saying you couldn't own it in any way. They definitely had an idea that, like, from this boundary to this boundary, this is our territory. We will defend it. But it was more like you're allowed to use this, and we're allowed to, if we think others are infringing on our livelihood, if they're hunting too much game and we don't have anything to eat, if they're chopping down timber that we need, we might go to war with them. This is our land. But it wasn't exclusive land ownership. And just about every year, and sometimes multiple times a year, the Dakota would negotiate with their neighbors, particularly the Ojibwe, sort of land usage rights, because there were these vast border areas that both groups would come and go through. And usually it would be a big meeting and there was a ceremony and there was a meal, and both groups would sort of negotiate, okay, yeah, this year you're allowed to hunt here. Game is plentiful. We won't bother you. You won't bother us. You're allowed to pass through here. We're allowed to pass through your territory. If we need wild rice, we can go to this spot that's in your territory. You know,
just making sure they're not stepping on each other's toes.
Yeah, making sure they're not stepping on each other's toes. And there was this continual negotiation. Now, once the French had established trade relationships with the Dakota, Ojibwe, and other indigenous nations, the French were frequently involved in the different annual negotiations over land use. And often the French wrote down the speeches delivered by all parties during these meetings. And reading these records, you can see exactly how the Dakota felt about their attachment to the land. So I'm going to cite just one example. This comes from a 1754 journal of a French negotiator named Paul Marin. And the context for this quote, a party of Dakota had requested meeting with him because they were concerned that the Ojibwe were encroaching into Dakota lands beyond what had been agreed upon. And they're going to this Frenchman because the French are trading with both Dakota and Ojibwe, so he can be kind of the middleman, they're hoping. So one of the Dakota leaders said, quote, "Here is a map of the Mississippi. No one could be unaware that from the mouth of the Wisconsin to Leech Lake, these territories belong to us. On all points and in the little rivers we have had villages. One can see the marks of our bones which are still there, which are the remains from our enemies having killed us. But they never drove us away. These are territories that we hold from no one except the Master of Life who gave them to us." So there is a pretty clear statement that the Dakota definitely were willing to defend their land, thought of this land as theirs, and yet it was a more flexible form of land use because every year they are negotiating with the Ojibwe and saying, hey, it's okay if you hunt here. It's okay if you wild rice there. It's okay if we pass through each other's term. And they, in the same speech later, emphasized to the Frenchmen they're talking to that they made deals every year with the Ojibwe, and they're only coming to him because the Ojibwe are exceeding that deal. So that's an example of the sort of agreements that are happening constantly between
their negotiations.
The negotiations.
Yeah.
And it's a completely different sort of thing from what the Americans are looking for, which is a real estate deal.
Yeah, a forever real estate deal.
It was different than the Western ideas of land ownership, which basically to own something means you own it exclusively. Dakota, it was the whole Oyate that owned the land. So it was communal, not individual. There wasn't like, this is John's plot, and this is Bill's plot, and this is Bob's. The community decided how to use this land. And also, they didn't have the right to tell anyone they couldn't pass through their land. And for the most part, hunting in this land, fishing, that wasn't a problem unless it became one. Again, times of scarcity are when you see warfare between these tribes and things.
It's just a different concept of ownership of land. Well, and it kind of reminds me of, I think we do have a conception quite a bit, at least in America, where it is like my individual family has owned this piece of land. The boundaries are very specific. But that really, like, as I think about it, I'm like, that's not a given in a lot of cultures.
No,
like,
this
is a bit of a reach because this is an ancient culture. But I mean, I know in biblical times, they had a set every however many years. There's a year where like all the boundaries are
like
reset.
The Jubilee,
yeah, exactly. And so it's like there is in different cultures, very different concepts of land.
Right. And even Western European concepts of land ownership have evolved over time. So as late as the 1500s, there were large swaths of land in England and France and elsewhere that were what were called in English commons.
Yep.
And they were under the sovereignty of the king, but they weren't owned by anyone. And anyone could pick firewood there. Anyone could hunt there.
Well, and when you messed with that, that was a big cause of revolt and things like that too. So it's much more fluid than I think we're able to see, like with our own kind of limited view.
Yes. Although by the time Europeans are colonizing North America in Western Europe, in cultures like England and the early United States, there is a very firm idea that to own land means you have an exclusive permanent title. No one else can do anything with your land without your say-so. And this is measured and you can put a fence around it and it can be something you can draw on a map. That is a very specific way of looking at land that we, I think, today mostly take for granted because that's the culture most of us were raised in, but it is not the only way of looking at land. And the Dakota, as well as other indigenous groups in the region, had a more fluid relationship. And the reason I'm stressing all this is one of the stereotypes that you'll often see is like, oh, the Indians didn't believe this could be owned. And it's a way of sort of like wiping it away, like, well, they didn't really care. They cared deeply. Not only is the confluence of the river Bdóte sacred to the Dakota, but the whole area around it. And there's various sacred sites. So the other thing that comes with Dakota land ownership is they were what anthropologists would call semi-nomadic. But what that really means is they move to different places at different times of the year. So they had permanent village sites, and often there was a summer village and a winter village, and they would return to those same sites again and again. But at different times of year, the whole community would pick up and follow the buffalo herds out onto the prairie for hunting, or they would settle at a wild rice camp where the rice is. So it's not where you live all year round. It's full of mosquitoes. Who wants to live there? But when the rice is good, we got to camp by the wild rice. There's a time when there's maple sugaring. It was all tied to the seasons and the different ways of subsistence. They had an incredibly rich and varied diet from things that are native here to Minnesota, but taking advantage of the natural game and natural flora and fauna, it required moving about with the seasons. And so when Europeans came in here with their ideas of what it means to be settled, what to own land means, they would often see a village site that was empty because they're out at this point of the year. Or they would meet the same leaders somewhere else and be like, wait, didn't you live over here? And they had this idea that the word that the white people used a lot was wandering. Oh, they're just wandering, which implies a sort of aimlessness and carelessness. And also, oh, they don't really care about the land because they just sort of wander wherever. That's not true. They had very specific routes that they took, and it was consistent. And they're
following where the food is.
They're following where the food is, and they're returning to the same sites again and again, year after year. So it's not like those sites are not significant. And also sacred and ritual sites. There were certain offerings that had to be given at certain times of years at certain places. So that was an important part of their tie to the land.
Doesn't that so often happen in cultures, though, where if it's not your idea of how things run, you just think that it is just
only our idea
or purposeless.
But if they had simply explained that they were going to their, summer estate, and they would return to their house for the season.
Yeah.
For the, debutante ball.
Then
they
every English lord would understand.
Right. Yeah. They would have been like, oh, no, it's just like how your lordship go, and then we would have been fine.
Hey, maybe we've preserved a bit of that, at least in cabin culture.
Now, part of why we've been emphasizing the Dakota view on lands is we want to look at a specific treaty and figure out what both sides of that arrangement probably thought at the time that they were getting. And when you have two cultures meeting, you're going to have two ways of looking at the world, in this case, two ways of regarding land and land ownership. Now, for the white people signing this treaty, it was pretty straightforward. Land is a commodity. It's something that can and should be owned. It can be owned by individuals. Ownership is permanent until you decide to sell it. It can be bought and sold like any other commodity. That is a very specific way of viewing land that had a bit of an evolution. So we're going to take just a moment and really quickly overview how people from Europe came to start claiming land in the Americas in the first place. Europe is operating in a theological mindset in which kings rule through divine right, and so everything is supposed to be good and holy and approved of by the church.
As opposed to today, when only presidents rule through divine right.
Exactly. Now, going way back to antiquity, you had all sorts of kingdoms constantly invading each other, and the official policy of the Roman Catholic Church was Christian sovereigns should not fight other Christian sovereigns unless it's what theologians called a just war. And there were all sorts of conditions that had to be met to make sure it was just. And simply saying, I want that land and I'm going to take it, that didn't cut it. That being said, of course, plenty of wars were fought just because someone wanted some land, but they always had to come up with some sort of excuse. And often this had to do with looking at genealogies and saying, this person doesn't have a right to rule. There's some other ruler that we think should be the rightful ruler, and we're going to install them on the throne. Often this was a tenuous claim at best, but they needed that excuse, at least when it came to conquering other Christian lands. Now, this starts to expand during the Crusades, in which the church says that lands that are not ruled by a Christian can be taken and new Christian kingdoms can be set up. And this justified the invasion of lands that were under Muslim control. And this really starts to expand again in the 1400s. And you have a series of papal bulls issued throughout the entire centuries-long course.
Papal bullshit?
Papal bulls. It like an announcement.
I know, I'm joking.
So you have the Pope setting a series of decrees that basically said that the Portuguese and the Spanish were able to take lands from the Moors who were currently ruling the Iberian Peninsula because they were not Christian, and that any lands that Portugal captures, Portugal gets to keep it. Any land that Spain captures, Spain gets to keep it. And out of this comes a theological doctrine that comes to be known as the doctrine of discovery, which basically means any Christian country can take land from a non-Christian people and it belongs to that country that did it first.
Finders keepers.
Now, it's worth noting, in 2023, the Catholic Church officially repudiated the doctrine of discovery and said that this was never sound theological teaching. So after 500 some years, this is no longer the policy, and they now say that this was always a mistake and never reflected good Catholic thinking. But this was the policy through which Spain and Portugal start claiming chunks of the Americas after Columbus stumbles his way over here. And in 1493, the Pope grants all of South America to Portugal and all of North America to Spain. And really, what the Pope's trying to do there is just prevent Spain and Portugal from fighting each other. You know, it's like a parent dividing up Halloween candy or something, because you both have enough. Stop fighting. France did not like the fact that they didn't get in on this, and France just decided it's going to claim a bunch of North America for itself. So France is like, the Pope doesn't get to decide who gets land, and you can't just claim something if you don't go there. The way you claim land, you have to send someone there, and you do a little ceremony, and then you've claimed it for the king.
Yeah, don't be crazy. You can't just show up and say it's yours. You have to also do a ceremony.
Yeah, and the French come up with this whole elaborate process. They have to have an official document called a procès-verbal, which is a written statement witnessed by someone, like a notary public. They would have an official representative of the King of France come out there along with representatives of the Catholic Church, and they would gather the leaders of the indigenous groups nearby, and they would hold up a cross, and they would sprinkle some holy water, and they would give this speech basically being like, you are now all subjects of the Kingdom of France.
Basically what Lucien Gaultier
Yeah, exactly. That's a sort of recycling of that.
On the hill.
Or a recasting of that story.
Arise and be henceforth
St. Paul. Yeah, and it was saying like, you know, congratulations, you are now subject to the King of France.
Isn't that great news?
Isn't that great news? There were varying responses to this, but you can imagine how well that went over. Often you have like a contingency of like 20 French guys, and they're surrounded by thousands of indigenous people they've gathered. And they're like, yeah, by the way, we rule over all of you. And sure. But what was important to the French is the words were said, someone wrote it down, we have that document. And we also sent out explorers to map out boundaries to say, like, this is the specific area we claim. But they're just making it up as they go along. France wants in, and this is their way of saying, like, the Pope doesn't get to tell you you have this land. You're not even there. Meanwhile, England is Protestant by the point that they start claiming land.
Oh, boy.
And they're like, well, yeah, the Pope doesn't get to tell you who claims
land. We're going to use
but also
rules.
The French, you don't get to claim land either. the only way that land can legitimately be claimed is by actually settling and farming the land. And England early on claims that this land is empty. Again, it wasn't. The early English colonists could testify to that. But the idea is like, yeah, we're just taking vacant land. But if you're not living here, you don't get to claim it. Now, that was pretty weak sauce.
So everyone's playing by different rules.
Everyone's
and none
playing
of them...
by different rules because these are all post hoc justifications for what was already happening. People were taking the land, and I think their concern was less, how do we justify taking the land? They didn't care about that.
And more, how do we justify it to each other?
Defend this land to each other? So after, basically, I stole it fair and square is what they're all wanting to be in a position to argue.
What's the quote? You're trying to kidnap what I've rightfully stolen.
Yes, you're trying to kidnap what I've rightfully stolen. That's exactly it. Spain is like, hey, you can't grab land in North America. The Pope said it's ours. And France like, yeah, you're not even here. We did a whole little ceremony and have paperwork. Do you have paperwork?
Then England says, the Pope? Who's the Pope?
Who's the Pope? Also, we're actually sending people there and not just extracting resources. Though, again, that was pretty flimsy sauce. Eventually, the Dutch, who are a tiny little country, they don't have big armies, they don't have big navies, but they have a lot of money because they've been trading. They start to just buy land from Native Americans. And eventually the English adopt this tactic as well, and the US will follow suit. And eventually the English start claiming we only buy land fair and square, unlike those Catholics who just conquer and seize things. Now, England had seized plenty of land early on, and these land sales, we should put heavy air quotes around that because often there was a lot of coercion and sometimes outright fraud. But the English story that they told themselves was, we buy land fair and square. And that was a tactic the Dutch started, but eventually the Dutch give up all of their holdings in North America after a war with England. So the Dutch are out of the game after that. But the Dutch process of negotiating treaties, that is what becomes the law of the land in England's claims. And in theory, it's two equal parties coming to the table and having a deal that both can agree to. In practice, of course, there's a ton of coercion, fraud, deception. But what was important was we have a piece of paper that says we own this, we can sell it, we can divide it into lots, we can carve up townships, do these sorts of things.
We can take it back across the ocean and say, look what we now own.
Look what we now own.
And now it's a commodity.
That's the best way. It's turning the land into a commodity.
Yes.
Because that's what it's all about. This was all ultimately about making money.
What I'm sure of right now, Alex, is that down the road, there will be no issues whatsoever regarding boundaries.
Yeah, exactly. Why would there be? Everyone's clearly on the same page.
Yeah.
No, obviously not. As you can imagine, eventually the European powers all go to war over their competing claims in North America. And this results in a global war known in Europe as the 7 Years' War, better known here in the United States as the French and Indian War, because the British colonists were fighting against the French and especially their Native American allies. But it's a world war. There's fights happening in India. There's fights happening in the Pacific. There's global ramifications of this. But
wait, real India?
Real India. Like
real
India.
Not
Columbus was lost India.
Columbus is special India.
Yeah, no. But long story short, the French were defeated by a coalition of the British, the Spanish, and their indigenous allies. And in 1763, France was forced to give its northern claims, so what's now Canada, to Britain, and Louisiana, which included the city of New Orleans and theoretically everything drained by the Mississippi, Louisiana goes to Spain. But again, none of this really matters on the ground. There are hundreds of different cultures and nations that are living in this area, and they certainly don't think of themselves as Spanish subjects or French subjects, but that's what it's labeled on the map. Meanwhile, you had all sorts of English settlers that were hungry to grab as much land as they could and constantly starting conflicts with the native people. Although there were quite a lot of colonists settled on the coast, once you got deeper into the interior, there were all sorts of indigenous groups being like, you can't settle here. This is our land. And willing to fight you back. And so in 1763, as part of that deal with France that ended the war, they drew a line through the Appalachian Mountains. and said, you cannot settle west of this. And the English colonists were like, what are you talking about? They saw the land as basically like a big pile of money that's just sitting there. And here I am poor when there's money I could grab. Why are you telling me I can't go grab the money? That was actually one of the reasons why the Revolutionary War happened. They were really, really mad at the proclamation that you couldn't travel past this line. But the reason Britain did that is not because they were such firm supporters of indigenous land rights. It's because they're like, you morons already got us into a global war by picking fights with indigenous people.
Yes.
And we don't want you doing it. Like, we can't keep defending you. The reason your taxes are so high is we had to send a huge army there to keep your ass safe.
During the French and
Indian War. But
so you have to now abide by this so we don't have to do that again.
You know, the 13 colonies, they're going to do what they did and they declare their independence.
Oopsie.
But then they negotiate a treaty in Paris. Crucially, there is not a single indigenous person at the treaty, so they don't get a say in this land.
Color me shocked.
Yep. Now, in the treaty that ends the American War for Independence, Britain ceded its land up to the Mississippi while retaining Canada and its Caribbean colonies. But somewhere in there is a boundary with the lands being claimed by Spain, which included, at this point, Louisiana and also what was known as East and West Florida. And the northern boundary of this was unclear, but the British didn't have to worry about that. Spain wasn't at that treaty signing ceremony. The Americans now think that they own everything on North America up to the Mississippi.
Can we just pause? I actually would benefit from a map.
Hey, Alex, popping in from the future to say that if you are someone who could use a map, we've posted a bunch of maps relating to this episode on our website. You can find it linked in the show notes, or head to minnesotaunknown.com/podcast and look for the post on episode 9. All right, back to the show.
Then, in 1800, Napoleon Bonaparte invades Spain and says, Louisiana's mine now. So now Louisiana is claimed for France. But again, all that's really changing is names on a map. Nothing has changed on the ground. And eventually Napoleon, who's busy fighting most of Europe and also defending against an uprising of enslaved people in Saint Dominique, he needs cash. And so in 1803, he negotiates a secret sale to the president, Thomas Jefferson, agreeing to sell Louisiana to the U.S. for the absurdly low price of $15 million. That was less than 3 cents an acre. That's equal to about 79 cents an acre today. So it's absurdly cheap even now. And Jefferson authorizes the sale in secret, only later telling Congress, and they immediately debate whether this is constitutional, because although the Constitution does say that the president and only the president and his authorized agents can make treaties, it doesn't say anything about buying land. A lot of the politicians at that time were arguing that buying land is something only states can do because the 10th Amendment says anything not specified in the Constitution is held by the states or by the people. The federal government can't buy land. And Jefferson considered a constitutional amendment that he was going to promote to justify the purchase, and eventually he just said, you know what, we're just going to do it. It's going to be good.
Hey, guys, you're going to love Louisiana.
And there's discussion of impeaching him, and the members of the House of Representatives hold a vote to deny the request for the purchase, but it fails by 2 votes, 59 to 57. But the point is, Jefferson was kind of inventing the rules as he went along, but he did establish the precedent that now the federal government can buy land. Now, after Napoleon's defeat, years later, France would say, hey, Napoleon didn't have a right to sell Louisiana in the first place because he didn't consult the French chambers, the French government. It was just Napoleon's little backroom deal with Jefferson. Meanwhile, the Spanish would say, we were forced to give up Louisiana, but now that Napoleon's defeated, we should have Louisiana back. And America said, no backsies. But to highlight the absurdity of all this, they're not actually purchasing anything. That land is held by the many, many different indigenous groups that are living there. And eventually this will get codified in a Supreme Court decision in 1823. And this is called Johnson v. McIntosh. And this codifies the series of laws of how the United States is supposed to acquire land from this point on. And Chief Justice John Marshall, in his majority opinion, cited the papal doctrine of discovery as saying that Europeans could be a discovering nation, which gave them title to the land against all other European nations. But title just meant they had, quote, the sole right of acquiring the soil from the natives and establishing settlements on it. So basically, title means dibs. We get to negotiate with the people who are living there. France can't, Spain can't, Britain can't. We have title to this land. But the land does not really belong to the United States. except it kind of does. He then says that the sovereignty of indigenous peoples were diminished, but the right of their occupancy remained. And he calls them, quote, domestic dependent nations. And this continues to riddle laws concerning tribal sovereignty to this day. It's all a mess. The people who probably have the biggest headaches in the world are lawyers who specialize in tribal law because it's a mess. So, yeah, it's a flimsy foundation to build your entire legal jurisprudence on.
And then your entire nation.
That is what our nation's built on. So, long story short, we have a bunch of different governments thinking they can claim land, but the United States has arrived, along with the English and Dutch before them, to this policy of we buy land. So, that's the macro view. Let's zoom back in. How does the land at Bdóte get bought? Well, it doesn't start with an initiative from the president. It doesn't start with an initiative from Congress. It doesn't start with anyone who's authorized to make a treaty. It starts with a guy who was scheming to sell a huge part of land to Spain and actively conspiring with the Spanish government. And this is a man named James Wilkinson. So this is where we're going to take a brief detour because this guy is exactly everything we love here at Minnesota Unknown. He's a scoundrel, a traitor, a con man, and he does play a significant role in the establishment of Fort Snelling eventually.
Scoundrel?
Yes.
I like the sound of that.
James Wilkinson is born in Maryland to a wealthy slave-owning family on a plantation, but he eventually kind of loses all of his family's money, even though he was born with a silver spoon. And around age 19, the American Revolution breaks out, and he goes north and joins the army, but insists because he's a gentleman, he has to be an officer. And they're like, well, whatever, we need officers. And he admitted, I wasn't particularly political. I didn't even know why we were fighting for independence, but I liked the idea of being in charge of people and wearing a fancy uniform. So James Wilkinson, he starts out as a lieutenant despite having no military qualifications or knowledge, but that's okay. I mean, most of the army was new at that point. But he ends up keep getting promoted. Eventually, he ends the war as brigadier general, and he is close on the staff to Washington, to Horatio Gates, to Anthony Wayne, to all the big military names, and he is lying to every single one of them, playing them all off each other. Because there is all sorts of factional infighting amongst the army officers. There's this whole conspiracy to try to remove George Washington because they don't think he's doing a good job. Because let's face it, for the first few years of the revolution, things were going badly. And basically, Wilkinson never leads a company in battle, but he's sort of an aide-de-camp to various people and keeps being sent to send messages back and forth.
Oh, so he's like a worm tongue.
Yeah, he's exactly a worm tongue. And everywhere he goes, he's like, those guys over there, I have a message from them, but they're trying to betray you. But if you promote me, I can help you get what you want. So he's playing all of them off each other. Just as an example of his character early on, this is a letter. If you want to read this, Major General Horatio Gates wrote to George Washington that all the officers are being turned against each other. And in the first draft of the letter, he quite explicitly blamed James Wilkinson and directly accused him of, quote,
sowing dissensions amongst the principal officers of the army and rendering them odious to each other by false suggestions and forgeries.
Capitals sprinkled plentifully throughout that quote.
Yeah, as was the style. And then he states that this amounts to a crime of the first magnitude and, quote, positive treason. And what's interesting is we today have both his original draft of the letter, which is what we just quoted, and the final letter that George Washington actually received. And he revised it to just leave whoever's doing this anonymous. So he cuts James Wilkinson's name out of it, and he sends Wilkinson back on another mission. And it seems like the mistake everyone keeps making is they're like, this guy's a liar and a scoundrel and just out for him, but he could be my liar and scoundrel. And they all think if we keep flattering him enough and promoting him enough and paying him enough, he'll be useful to me. It's kind of that whole like, keep your friends close, keep your enemies closer sort of thing, except they all don't realize how much he's just betraying them. Eventually, he's forced to resign, and eventually Horatio Gates and him fight a duel. They both fire into the air, as you're supposed to do, Aaron Burr, but the point is they got close to blows. But after the war, you have this immediate rush of settlers going across the Appalachians to what is called Kentucky, which is a broad geographic destination, basically being like everything over the Appalachians, that's Kentucky. And our friend James Wilkinson moves to Kentucky and starts claiming land. He's like, I'm going to get in on this. There's no official way to do things, but people just start building cabins and starting farms in the hopes that if, squatters' rights, if I was here first, I get to claim it. And as they do, they're getting into constant fights with indigenous people who are like, get out of our land. And this is causing all sorts of problems, enough that the early United States government redraws basically the same line that the British had drawn long ago that got us so mad in the first place. And like, okay, stop going west. You can't do it. But people do it anyway. So much of the early settlement west of the original 13 colonies was illegal immigration, people going into areas that the United States government was telling them not to.
But they just did it anyway.
Build a wall.
Yep. There start to be different coalitions of indigenous people fighting back. And eventually the United States Army fights an extended series of wars throughout the Ohio River Valley, basically conquering land and forcing their defeated enemies to sign treaties, signing over land. So, okay, now you signed it. Now it's good. But what's crucial for the people who are now densely settling in this vaguely defined Kentucky area is they're starting farms. They need to make money by selling their crops. To sell your crops, you have to get it to market. The only way to get these crops to market is by the river. You'd think you want to sell something to the east. You'd think you'd ship it east. No, mountains are in the way. Traveling over mountains. You could do it once for the purposes of immigration, but it's not a good way to ship regular crops of cotton and tobacco and sugar. But this whole area is drained by a bunch of rivers, and those rivers flow into the Ohio River, and the Ohio River flows into the Mississippi, and the Mississippi flows down to the ocean.
So sorry, the fastest way would be to send it down the Mississippi, back up around the coast of the ocean,
the Caribbean,
to make it to the East Coast.
Yep.
Okay, so you're taking the roundabout way, but it's actually faster.
Yeah, it seems crazy, but supply lines are crazy. So here's the problem for all those farmers in Kentucky. Spain still claims New Orleans and the Mississippi. And Spain at this point says you can't ship anything on the Mississippi.
So they basically said since they have the mouth of the river, we own the whole river.
Yep, that's exactly it. Now, as the name implies, New Orleans, this was a city founded by the French, but at this point, it's under Spanish control. This point being the 1790s.
Okay.
And this is where Wilkinson starts making inroads with Spanish officials.
Oh, no.
So during this whole period, he starts making contacts in New Orleans, and pretty soon he's negotiating secret deals with Spanish diplomats and ambassadors and businessmen saying, I can basically give you the area of Kentucky. And again, Kentucky at this point refers to like everything west of the Appalachians to the Mississippi. He's like, the Americans, they can't keep this. Their army is tiny. They ridiculously say that they don't want a large army now that the war is over. So the army's down to like 2,000 people. And Wilkinson is sending the Spanish lists of people who he thinks you could bribe and like how much they should be paid off for. He's like, here's all the political movers and shakers in Kentucky. If you pay them, we will secede from the United States and become a loyal subject of Spain. Although, of course, I get to be governor of this new Spanish territory of Kentucky.
That's the kind of governor we want.
Yep.
Spanish territory of Kentucky.
Spanish territory of Kentucky. And he gets really far on this. And it probably would have happened except then in all these wars that the United States is fighting with indigenous groups in the Ohio River Valley. Eventually, they need to make the army bigger. And a lot of the original Revolutionary War officers, they're aging out or they're retired or they've got other things. They can't find leadership for this army that they're enlarging. And Wilkinson is basically asked by the president to rejoin the army. And he eventually, pretty soon, is second in command of the army. The whole while still being a paid Spanish agent. They knew him as Agent 13.
Oh my gosh.
And he would send letters in this complicated cipher. And this was stuff that was all suspected by people during his lifetime, but we know it now because all sorts of documents have been found in the Spanish archives. Like they had copies of all this.
How recently?
Well, a big group of them comes out in 1854, but then throughout the 20th century, there have been various times where they keep finding more stuff about these secret deals. Yeah.
This is like an ongoing conspiracy.
This is an ongoing conspiracy over decades.
Wow.
So yeah, it starts in the 1780s up through the 1790s. He's now back in the army. He eventually is once again brigadier general. And again, the reason he's asked is he was the youngest general. He has the rank.
He's the only one with a rank who's not in a home.
But here's the thing. He's a brigadier general. He never led a single unit into battle in the entire Revolutionary War.
Yeah,
all he did was send messages back and forth.
Well, he was an aide de camp, you said.
Yes.
So he's what Hamilton was before he got his command.
And Hamilton hates him. Washington hates him. Gates hates him. Everyone hates him, but they're all like, I better promote this guy so
Hamilton
that he works for me.
Hamilton fought with a lot of people, but one thing that made them all get along is hating this guy.
Hating on Wilkinson. Yep. So he is conspiring, but he's also in charge of the army. And eventually this all kind of fizzles out and dies down. And there is a treaty negotiated in 1794 that sets an actual firm boundary with Spain. But most importantly, Spain agrees to let Americans ship on the Mississippi, and that settled things down. So Wilkinson is losing out, but the army's growing, and eventually, Wilkinson becomes head of the entire army when the actual commander-in-chief, Anthony Wayne, dies suddenly of what was probably a burst ulcer.
Head of the entire U.S. Army?
Yes.
Oh, no.
Again, this army, it's about 2,000 people, so it's small, but General Wilkinson is now the top-ranking army official.
That's kind of terrifying.
It is kind of terrifying. And throughout this whole period, he is still actively in contact with Spain, though as he keeps getting promoted, he sort of is leading them on more. He was all ready to go all in and like, we're declaring independence. We're going to hand this over to Spain. And now he's like, yes, we're still going to do it. Just give me more time and money. Just give me more. So he's like kind of leading the Spanish on, but he is still actively committing treason.
So people are like, literally Spain is falling into the same trap of like, he's a liar and a scoundrel, but he could be my liar and scoundrel.
Exactly. This is mostly outside of the purview of Minnesota history. For people who want the whole crazy story, and there's so much crazy story to this, I highly recommend the book An Artist in Treason, The Double Life of James Wilkinson by Andrew Linklater. It is an absolutely fascinating book, and there's so much that I'm leaving out here. But long story short, where this ends up is in 1805, Wilkinson is ready to betray his country once more and sell a huge chunk of land to the Spanish as long as they make him in charge of the army. But it's going to be an independent kingdom that is a vassal state of Spain. And the new king of this kingdom is going to be one Aaron Burr.
Oh my gosh.
So Aaron Burr, who you may know from shooting Hamilton, was also just recently the vice president of the United States.
Right.
In the election of 1800, he'd come within one electoral vote of becoming president.
This is pre-shooting Hamilton.
Pre-shooting Hamilton. And eventually Congress decides, and Jefferson's president, and Burr, his opponent, is vice president. And eventually they change things so we have what we have today, where the president and vice president run together, because Aaron Burr and Jefferson so didn't get along. But by 1805, he has shot Hamilton, and although he's not arrested, he's basically shamed out of political life, and he's scheming. And he starts contacting Spain, and his main way of contacting Spain is through their Agent 13, who he eventually learns is Wilkinson. And Wilkinson and Burr hatch this conspiracy to basically get Kentucky to declare its independence from the United States. They're going to whip up the fury. Meanwhile, Aaron Burr is going to assemble an army while Spain sends its armies to North America. And then Aaron Burr's army and Spain's army were going to take the independent state of Kentucky and force it to become a Spanish vassal state, which Aaron Burr will be king, and James Wilkinson will be commander-in-chief of the armed forces of this new kingdom of Kentucky.
So this is a kingdom of liars and scoundrels.
Yes. And the crazy thing is this came very close to happening. And the reason it didn't is James Wilkinson got cold feet. He seems to have been all in on it, and then for whatever reason, he starts doing the thing that he'd done for a lot of just leading both sides on.
Yeah.
He keeps writing to Aaron Burr, being like, yeah, it's going to happen. He keeps writing to Spain, being like, yeah, it's going to happen. But he eventually turns on the Spanish and reveals the whole plot of Aaron Burr to the United States.
Oh my God.
Aaron Burr is prosecuted. It's a whole trial. He eventually kind of wiggles out of it.
But okay, so he tells on Aaron Burr in the Spanish. He does not tell on himself.
Nope. There are all sorts of accusations,
right.
And he is put on trial after trial after trial, and they fail probably because they bit off more than they could chew. They basically threw so many accusations at Wilkinson, most of which were true, but only a few of them did they have solid evidence. And there were so many things that they didn't have evidence for that the jury was like, yeah, this seems like it just... And Wilkinson's saying, oh, it's a smear campaign. It's because I'm important. It's because I turned my back on these guys. They're betraying me. You know, the classic thing.
And that's why you should only charge on what you have absolute proof for.
So amazingly, Wilkin gets off scot-free, though a cloud of suspicion hangs around him for the entire rest of his life.
As is so richly deserved.
As is so richly deserved. Now, what on earth does this have to do with Fort Snelling in Minnesota? Well, in 1805, as he's actively plotting the conspiracy with Aaron Burr, Wilkinson decides completely on his own volition to send one of his young lieutenants up the Mississippi with a mission to acquire land for a fort.
Oh, no.
Now, it has never been proven that this was part of the Spanish conspiracy. And he would later say, like, yeah, so Lewis and Clark were going out up the Missouri. I thought I'd send a guy up the Mississippi. But he didn't tell the president. He didn't tell Congress. He just sends a 26-year-old lieutenant named Zebulon Pike. And Zebulon Pike was like a fanboy of Wilkinson, the only guy that seems to have not realized Wilkinson was a scoundrel. Zebulon Pike, in all of this, it's debated how much he knew, but the consensus of a lot of historians is he was just genuinely naive. Like, he was being used as a pawn and had no idea.
Not a great judge of character, Zebulon
His
Pike.
father, also named Zebulon Pike, had been close with Wilkinson. He had been in the army. Pike had spent his entire life at military forts.
So this is like his old family friend.
Yeah, old family friend, and he is really ambitious and wants to prove himself. And here are the specific orders that Wilkinson gives Zebulon Pike. So his instructions are basically make maps, record who you meet, and then, quote, in addition to the preceding orders, you will be pleased to obtain permission from the Indians who claim the ground for the erection of military posts and trading houses at the mouth of the river St. Pierre, the falls of St. Anthony, and every other critical point which may fall under your observation.
And the mouth of the river St. Pierre is?
That is the Minnesota River. The French called it the St. Pierre because the first group of French explorers that went there were 5 of them. 3 of them were named Pierre, and they were commenting on how funny that was. And then they realized it's the feast day of St. Pierre today. So they named it the St. Pierre's River.
So, okay, so it's fair to assume that he was at least thinking about Kentucky, maybe just claiming all the way up.
Yes. So here's what is unknown. Pike has had lots of defenders. He's one of those guys that's later sort of lionized as a hero. It does seem that Pike had no knowledge that Wilkinson was a traitor. However, because Wilkinson's kind of just doing this on his own and not telling the president or Congress anything, and given that it's happening during the height of the Burr conspiracy.
His conspiracy with Spain.
It seems that what's likely is that he sent Zebulon Pike in order to say, hey, and we also get the waterfalls on the Mississippi as part of this new kingdom that we're creating.
Because then they would own half of the trade route, which is a huge deal.
But Zebulon Pike himself was unaware if he was being used as a pawn.
He was a dupe in this. But Wilkinson, it's fair to assume, was doing it on purpose.
Is a guy that the only thing consistent about him is you should not trust him.
Right.
Now, Pike kept a detailed diary, and he would later publish this because after the Burr conspiracy is outed, anyone associated with Wilkinson is accused of being a Spanish spy. Again, nobody can prove anything, but like the accusations are out there. And Pike publishes his full journals and has a notary public say like, yes, this manuscript reflects the actual journals kept, basically to prove that I wasn't a Spanish spy. And because of that, we have really good documentation. Wilkinson has specifically tasked him to make note of things, so that's why we have this detailed journal. So in some ways, his mission is similar to that of Lewis and Clark. You know, go out, hand out medals, get good relations, but take careful notes on what's out there. But also get permission to build a fort. And this is what is going to bring us back to Fort Snelling. The beginnings of Fort Snelling, I think the broader context of land treaties and different ways of looking at land, that's going to all be incredibly relevant going forward, because what Zebulon Pike is about to do is buy some land, or at least that's what Zebulon Pike thinks. But there is a lot more twists and turns to come. So, as we're now zooming in on Bdóte, let's follow Zebulon Pike and see where this story goes. And on that cliffhanger, we will leave things for this episode. Be sure to stay tuned for part 2 of this story coming soon, and subscribe so you don't miss that episode as soon as it drops.
You can find detailed show notes for this and all episodes at minnesotaunknown.com/podcast. We'll post a link there to each episode, along with features such as accompanying images, links to more info, and lists of sources cited. If you have questions, comments, corrections, complaints, or compliments, please email us at info@minnesotaunknown.com. We'd truly love to hear from you, unless it's mean, and then I'll cry. You can find Minnesota Unknown wherever you get your podcasts. And if you have a moment to rate and review, that would really help others find us. We also give history walking tours around the Twin Cities. To learn more about our current and upcoming tours, head to minnesotaunknown.com. Minnesota Unknown is produced, hosted, written, and researched by Hannah Norton, Josie Bergman, and Alex Weston. Our theme song is by Union Shakedown. This episode is copyright 2026 by Minnesota Unknown, LLC. All rights reserved. Addressing recent confusion regarding... Sorry, I'm reading it again because I thought there'd be more of a statement and not just 12 loose facts.
There would be more of a statement? This is MNHS we're talking about.
I do have to say, though, does the part about various entities not make it sound like it's inhabited by 1,000 ghosts?
I think they are confirming officially that Fort Snelling is full of ghosts.
That Bigfoot lives at Fort Snelling?
Sorry, this is going to be our first 4-hour podcast.
Welcome to our 8-hour one.
Welcome to it's our walking tour of Minnesota. You can walk the whole state while you listen to this one episode.